Hello guys, UnoPro here, back for another Let's Talk Duelyst. Now today I am talking about control decks, and do these exist in Duelyst? Are they true control decks? Their place in the meta, and also looking again at some kind of design decisions that the developers have taken and that I believe they are taking. So if you see my balance philosophy video, it might be a little bit similar to that towards the end, but definitely a lot different at the start. So let's jump into things and talk about defining a control deck. Now, there's many different things you can say about control decks, and it definitely varies from card game to card game. But I think the primary thing when defining any control deck is it has to be primarily a reactive deck. What this means that instead of early on trying to push its own agenda, it's trying to stop its opponent and get to a certain point where then it will eventually execute its own game plan after it has dealt with its opponent's game plan. Now, in Duelyst, there's a lot of decks that a lot of the community will call a control deck, and they're definitely the most controlling decks that exist in the game. But are they really control decks? And I think I would have to argue that a lot of them aren't really control decks, but rather glorified mid-range decks with a bit more late game. And the primary reason for this is that these decks aren't reactive. Sure, they have good removal, but are they playing this removal because they want to stall out the game and get to a certain point? Partially. But a lot of their cards, often more than half their cards, are just proactive minions. They don't react to the board, they don't focus on dealing with their opponent's threats, they're simply pushing their own threat at a higher mana cost. So that's why I don't really think control decks have truly existed in Duelyst. But there are some that have come pretty close. Now, I think most people's minds will jump to Control Magma, and I do agree that Control Magma, at least through the history of the game, has been the one deck that's consistently be classified nearly as a control deck. Maybe not compared to other games, but in Duelyst it is definitely the go-to control deck. Now, Magma does have some pretty reactive cards, stuff like Plasma Storm, Eggmorph, Natural Selection, Metamorphosis. All of these cards are very reactive and they're very good removal. But has this made the overall game plan of Magma reactive? And I'm not too sure it has. And there's a lot of reasons for this, which we will go into. But if we just look at a normal Magma deck, a lot of the time they're still running stuff like Young Silthar, Veteran Silthar, all these very proactive minions, and their early game plan is not just to remove the board. They don't just want to hope to natural selection their way to turn 7. They want to be playing their own minions and then making their opponent deal with them. And that is how they saw the deck. So they're not really reacting. Sure, they have a lot more late game and they have this high value removal, but is this removal trying to stall or is it trying to get value and play a late game? So I don't really think that Control Magma is a true control deck, especially when we compare it to other card games. Now, those of you familiar with Hearthstone will know that Control Warrior, especially now that Elise is in the game, is a very, very controlling deck. It focuses almost entirely on removing your opponent's threats. You don't see it playing these early aggressive kind of minions because it just wants to remove everything and get to a certain point where it will then win the game. Now in Duelyst, this isn't really possible. There's a lack of good early game reactive minions, and so the best way for Magma to deal with this, instead of playing all these reactive cards, is simply to play Young Silthars, Vindicators, and then let your own minions deal with them. Okay, so I don't think that a true control deck really exists. And we have a lot of decent control games, stuff like Plasma Storm, Metamorphosis. They can be really, really strong in a control shell. So why don't we see a true control deck? Now, there's a number of reasons for this, and I will try and go over some of them. But primarily, there's a lack of card pool, or a lack of efficient cards that are good enough to make the card deck. Sure, we have natural selection early game, but then what else? What if your natural selection doesn't work? Suddenly, that reactive plan is no longer available. But there's a lot more to it than that. Primarily, when we look at Duelyst, what defines it as a game is the board. And on that board are mana tiles, which definitely increase the importance of having early game proactive minions. They reward the player who is able to get on the board early and seize control of that, gaining up to 3 mana tempo advantage. Now, in a normal situation without these mana tiles, a control deck, may go something like your opponent plays a 2 mana minion, you play a 2 mana removal, equal on tempo. Your opponent then plays a 3 mana minion, you play a 3 mana removal. Suddenly though, if your opponent's using these mana tiles, they may have paid 4 or 5 mana worth of threats and you only have 3 or 4 mana to deal with it. So that is when no longer will the mana line up with the threats because your opponent has out-tempoed you just because they are inherently a more proactive deck and able to take use of the mana tiles. So just as we can see, that the game doesn't allow for control decks just to trade 1-for-1 early game reactively. Now there is a counterfactor to this in that generals are inherently more defensive than in other card games because they will trade back. So you don't necessarily need to remove everything because your general can kind of mop up some. But I think in general most people will agree that having these mana tiles encourages a very proactive playstyle rather than reactive. Okay, so another reason, which kind of ties into my last point, is that the removal isn't efficient enough to make up for this trade. Now, a lot of the time, early game stuff, it's very hard to remove efficiently. There's a lack of good cheap spells that can remove your minions, and really, you kind of need your mana to be more efficient than your opponent's threats. And this is something I'll get into now. So this is kind of what I'm calling the removal versus threat problem. So let's say that I'm a Vitruvian player and I am, I have an Amaya healer in hand. Very, very strong card. Let me just get that up on board. Okay, so this minion, when unanswered, when not removed or dispelled, does a ton of damage and can often just win the game on the spot. So let's say I play this and then suddenly my opponent, who is a Magma player, decides he is going to deal with it with an Egg-Morph. Now, sure, I've spent 6 mana, and he's only spent 4 mana. Is this really that bad for me? Well, if my opponent is a true control deck, it's unlikely they'll be able to, punish that slight mana tempo gain, and also, he has to use an attack from his general. So that's not too bad. We can say that scenario is pretty equal. We haven't really lost anything as a proactive player. Okay, so let's say, we're in the same scenario, but I don't have an Amaya healer in my hand. Maybe I have a couple 2-drops, maybe I just have a random minion, and my opponent has an Egg-Morph. And let's say none of the minions I play are an Egg-Morph target. Now suddenly, I haven't lost anything by having a Amaya healer. I have different cards in my deck that are fine, and now my opponent has a dead card in hand that doesn't have a good target. So he's kind of lost in that scenario. Or you can say it's a draw if he finds an equally good target. Either way, not having the threat is not a problem. So let's say I have an Amaya healer and my opponent doesn't have Egg-Morph. Suddenly that is a very, very bad situation for the Magma player. Being reactive, if he doesn't have the answers, if the answers don't line up with the threats, suddenly that is a lot worse. But if I don't draw my threats, or the bigger threats when my opponent draws his bigger removal, that doesn't really bother me. It can kind of even be an advantage because my opponent might have dead cards in hand. So it's really a situation where having the threat is a lot better than being the one having to answer it. And this is multiplied by Duelyst other factors, but we can just see in this basic example that you want to be the one making the threats. So why would anyone ever play reactive cards? Well, it comes down to the fact that there is a potential advantage to be gained out of being the one to react if you can get an advantage out of it. So in the case of Egg-Morph, yes, you may get 2 tempo, 2 mana's worth of tempo. It does depend, can you punish that? Also may be a situation where, you need to have these must-answer threats, which Amaya healer definitely can be. But as we can see, you'd rather be the one with the Amaya healer than the one relying on drawing that Egg-Morph to deal with that potential Amaya healer. Okay, so that's just an inherent part of card games where you want to be the one making that proactive move onto the board, pushing your own agenda, and forcing your opponent to have the answers. Because if they don't, you may just win. Okay, so on to my next point, and that is, the lack of good card draw. Now, we see stuff like Sojourner and Mogwai, and they're basically the only threats that draw cards just for yourself that can do it pretty consistently. Now, these are neutral cards, and they're decent, but they're not good enough to win the game on their own. They're not value engines in the sense. Many decks can run them, and every deck is kind of running at least one form of card draw a lot of the time. Some decks don't, of course, but you really need to have a way to get ahead of your opponent if you're going to be consistently trading 1-for-1 with removal. If you can find a way to do that, well, I could do that 6 removal spells in hand, my opponent has 6 minions, suddenly we get to 0 and all. If he draws a minion, I don't have an answer, it's game over. So you need a way to get to a point where you can outvalue your opponent if you can just keep trading 1-for-1. Now, because card draw, especially in faction card draw, is very, very weak at the moment. You kind of have to rely on these big threats, which comes back to another problem in that nearly every deck in the game runs some kind of removal or ways to deal with big threats. If we look at Songhai, we have Onyx Bear Seal. Vayner has a ton of ways to do it. Liner has stuff like Martyrdom. Even Sunbloom can work depending on the threat. We see even Vitruvian has a 0 mana Dispel, which can help tempo out, and Repulsive Beast is a neutral card. So it's hard just to get to a certain mana card and then drop a card that can't be answered, because there are so many answers in Duelyst, and even aggro decks will be running a lot of removal depending on the faction. Okay, so these are a lot of the problems which really stop control decks being too prominent, because the game is kind of built against them. And so we need some really, really strong reactive cards that can create a lot of advantage by themselves, plus we need a way to finish the game. So it all kind of, there's a lot to add up there. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about was the introduction of Bloodborne spells and how they can possibly affect the existence of control decks. Now, there's actually two ways you can look at this. The first way is that, Bloodborne spells offer an alternate win condition, and, one that doesn't involve putting a card in your deck. For example, let's take Varth. Varth gives +1 permanently to his general, a very, very strong ability, which, all things being equal, will beat most generals at some point. Now, that's assuming you can stay healthy, keep trading 1 for 1, and get to that late game point. If you can do that, if that can be your win condition without having to spend a card on it, that means that all these slots that before were dedicated to finishers, suddenly can be freed up to removal and surviving. So that makes, these decks better at controlling, because they don't have to worry about their win condition. Let's take a look at control Magmar decks, for example. Before, we saw players like Dresbo, running heaps and heaps of late game legendaries, Exhume, Silver Elders, Archon Spellbinders, all these different cards. Because it had to, even though it could get to the late game sometimes, it had to also make sure it won there. Bloodborne spells can give the option to make sure that a control deck will always win in the late game, or, all things being equal. I think another example of this is Cassiva. That power to create more Shadow Creep and have those Shadow Novas means that those 3 Shadow Novas are basically your win condition there, along with your Bloodborne spell. So the rest of the deck can basically be about surviving early game, and having survival tools, basically. Now, the survival cards aren't really there at the moment, so Cassivas often have a lot of proactive cards, but that's a whole nother story. So these Bloodborne spells can offer an alternate win condition. Now, there's a couple problems with this. Well, first of all, a lot of the time, control decks the problem wasn't really just winning in late game. It was more about, getting to late game. And have we really seen a lot of cards, a lot of Bloodborne spells, that help decks get to the late game? And I'd say not really. We saw Sarge, which definitely is a, controlling hero power or Bloodborne spell. That's more of a weakness problem, not a design kind of problem. So that's kind of too weak to help you get to the late game. Xerix is good at controlling, but is even better when using an aggressive deck. All these other hero powers aren't too good. You could argue Cassiva, but 1 damage ping isn't really a ton, and it's more about generating that late game win condition than surviving. And we just really don't see a lot else. Another thing to note is that Bloodborne spells are undeniably very, very strong abilities. Some abilities, you don't really want to be missing your Bloodborne spell. You have 2 turns to use it, without, it refreshing when you didn't use it, and effectively wasting this really powerful 1 mana spell. So, if you want to be using it every, 1 every 2 turns, and trying to make sure you use it whenever you can, does that line up well for control decks? And I think, unfortunately, the answer is no. The thing is that a control deck often has a very specific answer, or set of removals that it has to play in order to deal with your opponent's threats. If I'm a control deck, I may not have a 1 mana answer, a 2 mana answer, a 3 mana answer, and a 4 mana answer to all of my opponent's minions. I may have to use my 4 mana removal when I have 4 mana, which may mean I might not be able to play my Bloodborne spell that turn. However, if I'm a more aggressive deck, I may often have a 1 mana minion, a 2 mana minion, a 3 mana minion, and a 4 mana minion. Come on 4 mana, and I think it's important to use my Bloodborne spell. Suddenly, instead of playing that 4 mana minion, I'll just play my 3 mana minion, or my 2 and my 1, and then suddenly I can use my Bloodborne spell. Aggressive decks tend to be a lot more flexible in spending their mana, which makes fitting in those very important Bloodborne spells a lot easier, whereas a Magma player may be forced to use Plasma Storm on turn 5 and Metamorphosis on turn 6, suddenly you've wasted a Bloodborne spell. So that's how they kind of affect control decks. there is definitely potential that as more removal comes out, more survivability comes out, less and less cards will need to be dedicated to winning the game because of these Bloodborne spells. But at the moment, I just don't think the tools are there. Now, I can talk all day about how good are control decks, do they exist, and what are the problems with them. But we need to also consider, do the devs want well, I've been considering a true control deck to exist in the game? And the answer is I'm not quite sure that they do. Duelyst is primarily unique, as I've said, because of the board and because of the importance of positioning of minions. Control decks tend to not care about the board too much. They simply want to remove everything off the board. If you're playing a minion and then your opponent's removing it regardless of where it is, well, suddenly positioning and that board movement is completely gone from the game, which I do not think the devs want that to happen. Now, we can have control decks that exist in balance with the board. There's a lot of spells that are dependent on positioning. However, these are kind of inherently weaker, as players will get better at moving around them, and they have to be a lot stronger when they hit compared to when they're useless because your opponent positioned well. There's also just a lack of card pool within regards to this. We see a couple spells that work within positioning and that are decently balanced, but when you're a control deck, you're not really punishing your opponent for taking their time. If I want to make a greedy play with my minion and keep it out of this potential Egg-Morph range, for example, that's fine if my opponent is not going to punish me dropping a proactive threat. So certainly these control decks need ways to punish players who can easily play around their removal, or the removal has to be catch-all, which suddenly takes away from the board. So there's a little bit of a conundrum in making removal that is interactive, that can't just be played around unless you're playing a proactive deck. We also can see that in other games, these kind of control decks tend to be uninteractive and often complained about. Take Freeze Mage, for example, doesn't interact with the board at all. Now, I think Duelyst devs definitely do not want this to be the way that it goes in this game. Let's take a look at some of the more stronger controlling cards, and we can automatically see how these strong controlling cards that are allowed to exist still encourage heavy board interaction. For example, Metamorphosis was 5 mana, still very, very strong at 6 mana, and can often serve as a full board wipe if used correctly. Now, this card is inherently, by itself at least, about interacting with the board. I can always position around Metamorphosis in most scenarios by just playing my minion away from the attack range of any of my opponent's generals or creatures. So already we can see it's interactive. And it's not just good on its own. It's not a catch-all board wipe. It can be with Spirit Harvest, but that's a 9 combo plus Flash Reincarnation. And if they want to pull it off with a Spirit Harvest on the board, already your opponent is interacting. They're playing around the board trying to kill the Spirit Harvester before this can happen. So this is, even though it's a card that affects all minions, we can still see the inherent importance of board control and board positioning when we look at this card. Another one is Holy Immolation. So Holy Immolation is obviously a very positioning based card. Playing in diagonals automatically removes it, removes its full effectiveness, walking away from minions and leaving a 2-space gap automatically reduces its effectiveness. So we can see that it's very interactive removal, even though it's very strong. The devs don't have a problem with late game decks that have a lot of removal existing, I do not believe, as long as they're interactive and still about the primary focus of Duelyst, which is the board. And this is why Holy Immolation, as I talked about in another video, is allowed to exist. It's very, very strong, above the average power level, but it's an interactive card that can allow decks to be a bit more controlling. There's counterplay. As the dev's name suggests, that's what it's all about. Counterplay, positioning on the board. I wanted to bring up another problem with control decks that I believe is highlighted in this card. Now, if you're making a control Lion-Eye list, you'll definitely want 3 Holy Immolations in. But in a control list, this card gets a little bit worse. Now, it's still a very good card, but say you're playing a more aggressive list, you're likely to have a minion live, suddenly you can attack with that minion, heal it up, and you're getting even more value out of this insane card. So it encourages being proactive and playing lower cost minions, so you can always have a Holy Immolation target, all these kind of things that kind of push these strong controlling cards away because they get more value in an aggro or mid-range deck. A card on a similar note is Mechanical Warbeast. Now Mercanta Warbeast, again, it functions on its own. It's a very, very strong card at cleaning up the board by itself. But this card can also get a lot more, a lot more value in an aggressive or mid-range shell. You can buff it up so it doesn't die to a general attack. Also, often it will leave itself at 2 health after attacking a general and frenzying another minion. Now, if you're in a control deck, suddenly your opponent just, you've killed one minion, you dealt 4 damage, and then they finish it off with their general. Sure, you've dealt 8 damage, to their general with a minion, but you've only cleared one of their minions, you've traded 1-for-1 cards, maybe even lost some mana tempo. And if you're a control deck, that 8 health might not matter at all. So, but suddenly, if you're in an aggressive deck, you can attack with a 4-4 and leave 2 4-2s. Suddenly, your general the opponent's general can't clear both of them, and you're going to get even more value out of them. So these cards lend themselves to board control. Now, is it impossible for decks to be focused on board control and be reactive? Well, I don't think so. I think that reactive minions definitely could have a place in this game, and defining and creating true control decks in Duelyst. We have seen that the devs have, released some definite cards, that are applicable to this. We've seen a buff to Primus Shield Master, a provoke minion, which is, a lot more reactive than other minions. We've seen stuff like Bone Reaper left. We've seen more provokes, lots of dispels. There's lots of different ways that a deck can have reactive minions. But when a control deck gets a chance to drop 4 mana, should they be dropping a very aggressive veteran Silver if they're a control magma, or should they be trying to drop, a provoke or a more defensive minion? And I think as the game progresses, we see more reactive minions. Then we may see truer control decks start to come out. Now, obviously, it won't be like other games where there's heaps and heaps of spells, and they don't really matter what's on the board. I think the way that control decks react will always be based around the board, at least primarily. And often reactive minions, because then they can fight for this mana tiles, they can fight for board control, while still being a truly reactive control deck. It's also important to note that we basically have very little catch or removal when you actually think about it. All of the removal that we have is, often based on board positioning. So let's consider, Hellstone Prison. Hellstone Prison is one of the exceptions, but returning a card to hand is not a true removal, and it also depends on other factors like card advantage and that kind of thing. So we're not going to consider that true removal. Even Onyx Bear Seal you can position your minions to play around Onyx Bear Seal. If your opponent plays an Onyx Bear Seal on one of your minions, you need to be prepared for that Onyx Bear Seal to potentially block your opponent's path of a minion or general. So that is already, positioning is very relevant, even if the spell can be cast on anything. And often there are games where, a late game situation, I will focus heavily on placing my minion, playing around Onyx Bear Seal to block an attack. And we don't actually see a lot of non-interactive straight removal spells. Martyrdom is one we see, but the healing effect is essentially relevant to board control, even because your general has an attack value. So the more health you have, the more you can control the board of your general. Obviously that one's a bit looser. It is quite a catch-all removal, but definitely still relevant to board position and playing proactively. Even other stuff like Eggmorph and Metamorphosis are very good examples of this, where the removal can target anything. It can deal with most minions, but if your positioning is not good or your opponent plays around it, suddenly there's ways to deal with it. So I think in summary, we currently don't really see a lot of true reactive control decks, and there's a lot of reasons for this, but it's primarily about the rewards of being proactive in this game. Now, I don't think the devs have anything against control decks as long as they are about board positioning and movement. I don't think the devs want just catch-all spells that can deal with everything regardless of board positioning. But there's definitely a place in the future as more expansions come out, as decks get changed, refined. We can see decks that are primarily reactive rather than proactive. And it's definitely something that you want for diversity. A lot of players will come into Duelyst, say, I love playing control decks in other games, what can I play? You can link them to Control Magma deck list, but they're still going to look at it and say, well, there's 20 proactive minions, I'm not really reacting. And some players like a reactive playstyle. Anyway, that's enough for this time. If you have any thoughts on control decks, what you think the devs' positions on them, I'd love to hear them. And if maybe you do consider Control Magma a true control deck, even though it plays a lot of proactive minions. Leave your thoughts below. If you want to see more of these or more S rank gameplay videos, make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.